Hi, Estelden here. So I finished Beyond a Steel Sky. I went in expecting 0, expected to walk out with 0, but no. It was actually really good. I really appreciated that they had made it a classic point-and-click adventure for the most part. There were not really any gimmicks that kind of derived from the actual point-and-click experience. It was all pretty damn solid. Fantastic locations, the characters are good. It was great to see Foster and Joey again and see that dynamic kind of carry on. And so I was shocked. I didn't think in the landscape that we're in 2020 that a game could release for Apple Arcade first, eventually come to PC, and then find out that it's just a traditional point and click. There's none of the garbage that we've seen kind of plague the genre for quite a long time, I would say, at least in the mainstream. So for me, all I was really looking for was I just wanted a game that was full length, so it wasn't split into kind of parts, or it wasn't like really short and there wasn't much to do. I just wanted that. I wanted traditional puzzles, traditional dialogue, and essentially just a well-crafted kind of game that I could honestly call and point and click and not a walking simulator or something like that. That's what we got here. Beyond a Steel Sky, if I had to rate it, I'd probably say, yep, it's good, it's very good. It's not a classic, but in a genre that's absolutely fallen off a cliff, at least for me, I'd say the last highlight, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago in a video, but Thimbleweed Park, that's been the highlight for me in probably the last 5 years. It's been downhill since then. This has kind of raised the bar again. So Thimbleweed Park, we're probably up here, and we've gone down, and then we've climbed back up again thanks to this game. So that gives me a bit of optimism. When I spoke about point and clicks, as I said a couple of weeks ago, I thought they were in a really dark place, and I'd only just got into this game, and I was thinking, it looks okay, but what's going to happen? Well, since then I went into Union City, which is the bulk of the game. That's where you spend the bulk of your time, and it looks fantastic. The environments, the backgrounds, I think they really did a really good job. I think it's Dave Gibbons. He seems to really know what he's doing, and he's nailed this brand new atmosphere. And there's going to be a few spoilers, just to warn you now, but what I really liked, it wasn't just absolutely retreading the first game. That was my worry. It's always my worry when they bring you back to some old nostalgic classic, that all they're going to try and do is perhaps bring some old fans in who go, yeah, look, I remember that, and that was my worry when I saw Joey again on the front page and on the cover, that he was a droid again. I thought, geez, how are they going to go about this? Are they going to almost retcon the first game and make it a bit irrelevant? That's certainly not what they did. It's got a coherent story. So Beneath a Steel Sky to Beyond a Steel Sky, beginning to end, it's like one story. They don't fuck with anything that happened at the end of one to a degree that makes it not matter. And that's something I can really appreciate. So when you get into Union City and the bulk of the game, get these great environments. It's completely different. It's not dreary. It's not like a slavey kind of city where there's authoritar and there's nothing that can be done for the people. This time the people seem to be the ones that are happy. And the core theme throughout the game is that everyone here is happy. No matter the cost of their freedoms or their choices in life, they're all meant to be happy. And it has a feeling of real fakeness, and it's a really interesting theme at the moment with what's going on in the world, and when you think of China and things like that with their social credit system, that's brought up here, and I can't help but think, at least whenever this started development, that had to be where they were kind of pulling it from. I found it really interesting, and it was really nice to play something that was relevant today without being forced with a whole bunch of over-the-top political stuff. It was just something that was nicely contained in the story, true to the world, and that's what I wanted to see. So the puzzles have a pretty reasonable range, some being pretty simple, some being a lot more interesting, where you felt pretty satisfied in solving them, and that's what I want out of an adventure. I want to solve the puzzles and not think, gee, that was easy, it just involved a lot of walking around. I knew what to do straight away, but then I had to go through the motions to make it happen, and that was boring. There's not too much of that. I think most of the time, if there was a puzzle, it kind of clicked for me after a while, and then solving it was really cool to see it work, and I thought, gee, I thought this was the answer, but it wasn't 100% obvious. I know I said there was no gimmicks. The only thing that would be close to that is there's this hacking device in the game, and what you do with it is there's this program called Minos, which is controlling all of the technology around the city. To give an example, there might be a cleaning droid that is cleaning bathrooms, and it's set to aggressive, so it's like aggressively cleaning, it's doing it all it can. And then there's another machine or something to that effect inside the same room, and that might be cleaning things, or it might be doing something slowly. So maybe it's even just, I'm going to give an actual first-rate example, it's waving a hand. It's actually Joey's hand that's been preserved in a museum. And what you need to do is use the hacking device to change Joey's hand, so it's no longer just waving nicely, it's actually going to do something else. And it sounds ridiculous, but it helps you to solve a puzzle, and it made me kind of look around the room and really explore, figure out what was going on, and I had to use a bit of thinking and logic to solve it. It wasn't just mind-numbing and brainless. So that was really cool. There's probably an overuse of that item in the game, but I'd say overall it was still far better than it just being a walking simulator, or maybe like in adventure games where there's like one item you can pick up in a room and then you're just using it on like the one other item in the room that you can actually interact with. So it's nice to not get to that level of simpleness, I would say. It's nice for it to be a bit more advanced. I'd say in future I'd like to see more of a balance, because you use this hacking device a lot. So probably by the end of the game you're using it 80% of the time to solve puzzles. The other 10% maybe the crowbar, the other 10% maybe another item. But overall, pretty cool, and I really like the puzzles. Looking at the locations, they're reasonably varied. It'd be nice if there was maybe, I'd say even one more area. An example of maybe them overdoing the same areas is there's a period in the game where you have to go to this ball, and it sounds really exciting. It's like a celebration of everyone essentially following the system and behaving best they can for the year. Unfortunately, they used the same location as somewhere you went earlier in the game. They've just redesigned it and kind of jigged it up with some streamers and some fireworks and things like that. It would have been cool if that was its own location, just to make it a bit more varied and have you explore around a little bit more. What can actually happen too is when you revisit locations, sometimes it won't be updated, and this is a big spoiler, but there's a character who dies in the game, and then when you're examining items around the room still, sometimes it doesn't register that he's actually dead. So I might examine, it was a whiteboard, for example, and he said, Foster, the main character, he said, oh, I don't want to tell him about the formulas because they're wrong. And the way he said it, it was like, well, but he's dead. Like, surely that would kind of register and change now that I'm looking at it. That sort of things can just make exploring and clicking on everything feel a little less rewarding. And I really like doing that in adventure games, because that's where you kind of take in the world and you get to experience all the humour and the fun. And between Foster and Joey there is a lot of fun. And that brings me to the characters, which are, I would say, fantastic. There's a lot of really cool characters. It begins from the very start of the game when you're trying to get into Union City. There's a truck driver, he's a bit of fun. There's these kids as well. They help you out, and the interactions, the characters are all very different. They've got their own personalities. Doesn't feel kind of forced or generic. No one's kind of got just a generic stereotype about them. They're all pretty interesting, and they have their own goals and things they're trying to achieve in the game, and you're kind of just along to hear about them and maybe solve a few of their problems. So a lot of really cool characters. It continues throughout the game. We're constantly introduced to new people. Maybe the only fault in that was I would say, like the secondary villain to some degree, who is one of the ministers in control of the city, or so you think. He's kind of boring. He just keeps bumping into Foster, and he never really goes into antagonistic territory until the last minute, and then you just kind of get rid of him very, very quickly. So I feel like perhaps there's a little bit more tension, and there's a few more moments where you're kind of worried about what he's up to. That would have been cool, just to get a bit more development there, but overall I enjoyed the characters, and it was pretty damn nice. Lastly, I'll touch on the soundtrack. It didn't bring me back to the first game. That was maybe the only thing that's missing, but I think that's a problem with video games as a whole. A lot of them have gone the Marvel route, which is that they don't seem to really put a big focus on the soundtrack anymore. I think in 5 years' time, how many games that aren't Nintendo games or aren't like platformers are we going to look at and say, gee, that soundtrack, that was so nostalgic, that was really cool. I did a video on Breath of the Wild a few days ago, and to me, the music in that game was just miles below anything we've seen in that series. And I know they were going for a specific style, but I feel like sometimes that's a bit of a cop-out because they don't want to have the music be a main kind of feature and a main focus for the audience. Apparently it confuses them or something. I don't understand why, because the tracks that really stick with you have fantastic melodies and follow you throughout the game. They're the memories that you have years later, and you can chuck on the OST, you can listen to it, and it brings you right back, and it can add so much. There was some alright music in the game, but nothing that brought me back to the first one, or even anything in most of the Broken Sword games. Overall, good game. In the context of modern adventures, fantastic game, and I want to see a lot more of it. I want this to be the start of something and not just another outlier in a genre that's going to be basically dead for the next decade. I don't want that to be the case. I want players, developers, look at where this is at, see that there's an audience for these games, and actually take this forward. That is integral to me for the future of point and click. What really doesn't help, and I was having a good look, because when I got into this game and I checked out a few reviews, I was kind of worried. A lot of people said the game falls apart in the last hour. I didn't feel that at all. I felt like it was a really nice way to tie in the first game to the sequel without them both being kind of standalone and retreading old ground. It was really nice to see them do that and make it not just a nostalgia trip. So then to see the reviewers call that a negative, I don't understand. Sure, they can have their opinion, but I sort of wonder sometimes if there's something else at play here. I feel like a lot of these reviewers who look at the game, they haven't played the first one at all. They've maybe looked at a few story points on Wikipedia, and then they've decided they'll take that knowledge, look at the sequel, and then dissect that as well. Because there's some horrible reviews that do a disservice to this genre and a disservice to the game. Case in point, we have Gamespot. Now, they've done a fairly lengthy written review on the game. They've given it a 5 out of 10. Mediocre. And the problem with these big game reviewers, and you can say, well, why are you reading those? Just go and look at some of the small ones. That'd be fantastic. But if this game doesn't sell, then there's not going to be future ones, and it's going to set a precedent with other game companies that point and click are not worth a road going down, because even if you get like an established old series, I'm going to call it a series now because of this title, but essentially that means there's no point, they're not going to sell, let's just make walking sims or walk away altogether. That's a worry for me, and when I see what GameSpot are doing, it's a real worry. So they call it mediocre, and I can tell you that right now, if they were reviewing anything from a big publisher, this would not be getting a 5 out of 10. IGN, GameSpot, Polygon, whoever it might be, they have an absolute habit of giving mediocre trash from some of the AAA developers, whether it's something like Assassin's Creed Unity, whether it's Anthem. They'll be generous for those games. To me, they're 5 out of 10s, at least at launch. And that's what they're going to be reviewing it on, so the launch experience. But they don't do it. They'll give it like a 7, they'll give it an 8, and they'll say, yeah, there's some issues here, but a lot of people worked on the game, there's still some good graphics, yep, it gets up to an 8. So, it's annoying, because when they look at a game like Beyond a Steel Sky, Yooka-Laylee, any sort of small studio game, they'll absolutely shit on it, because they know they've got nothing to lose. And it's embarrassing, because it means that indie developers are always going to be at a disadvantage, because a game goes out, the general buying public, they don't care. They're not going to turn around and say, oh, but it's a small studio, I'm going to give them an exception. They're just going to look at the Metacritic score, and that's what they're going to go off. So I'm talking like a normie, so someone who's not experienced with the series, probably considers a point-and-click adventure game to be The Walking Dead, not someone who's very familiar with it and going to buy the game no matter what and check it out and give their own opinion. Adventure games need people who are a little bit more casual to get into them if they're going to survive. There's not enough people who are into the old experience who are going to come back, buy the game to keep things trudging along and keep these games viable and developers incentivized to actually go out and make more of them. So coming back to the review, it touches on a couple of things that like sums up the story, but then there was something that was a really big red flag to me. The GameSpot reviewer has said, unfortunately, many of the game's ideas and themes aren't examined in much depth. The kudos system, pronounced like kudos with a Q, which dictates a citizen's worth, so that's that China-like social credit system I mentioned. It seems like the basis for a clever mechanic of social climbing when it's first introduced, but rather than requiring you to integrate yourself within the rules of society, you can overcome any obstacle by solving traditional use X on Y adventure game puzzles. So what they're doing here is they're kind of demonizing actual point-and-click puzzles. Let's not forget that's the genre that this game is actually developed here. This is what they're trying to do. They want to be a traditional point-and-click adventure. There's not many of them around anymore. And instead GameSpot say, why are you doing that? You should have like something we would see in Assassin's Creed or something like that, and you should have like a social credit system where you go around boosting your ranking. Wouldn't that be cool? No, absolutely not. If that was the basis of the game, I would have been extremely disappointed. I don't want them to be like chasing trends and doing all of that stuff. I want them to make a classic point and click with none of the garbage. Please stay away from giving your thoughts on a game or a genre that you have no interest in, clearly. Because that's all we're seeing here. We're seeing someone who doesn't want a point and click adventure. They've called that essentially outdated, and it's not. Why? Because Telltale were making a living for a long period of time, and they've set themselves up again, and they're going to continue this by making point and click adventures supposedly that were actually walking simulators. Are you going to tell me that solving logic puzzles, using your head, actually having engaging gameplay is outdated, but walking around and talking to a few characters and making meaningless choices is relevant and that's the way forward? Piss off. That is disingenuous, like, completely. That's exactly what I do not want, and it's the reason that the genre has kind of failed, because developers have been so scared about confusing players and them getting stuck that they're not willing to make engaging puzzles that make people think. And they're the memories people will have of those games. It's like Dark Souls. If you get stuck on a hard boss, it takes you 3 hours. Plenty of people, plenty of the audience who will buy the next game and become loyal followers of the series, they're going to press on. If it's a well-crafted boss and it just happens to be difficult, once they overcome that challenge, they're going to absolutely be hooked because you've made great design. It's pretty original when you compare it to other AAA games, which are just really just like chore-like gameplay at a lot of times where there's no challenge and the things you're doing over and over feel really samey because there's never any variety because they don't want to confuse the player and have them have to learn something new. So I'm really disappointed that a mainstream site would demonize the developer for using traditional point-and-click puzzles, even though they tried something new with the hacker. So it's pretty disgusting. And another thing that they tried to say, and this is where I can kind of tell that the person writing this has absolutely no interest in point and click. They don't understand the history of the genre and why people like it, why people might want to actually play this, and they might want to see games like, whether it's Beyond a Steel Sky or Thimbleweed Park, see more of that type of game. It's when they say this: after the genre struggled to adapt into 3D and was briefly declared dead by pundits, the genre's resurgence occurred on two main fronts: the simplified, story-driven 3D games of Telltale, which focused on choice and consequence over puzzles. Give me a fucking break. There is no consequences in those games. At very best, it is choice and nothingness. There's never a consequence, because no matter what you do, and I've tested this a lot, so many people have over the years, if you make a different choice, you essentially get the same thing, it's just presented slightly differently. That is not a consequence. As someone who really enjoys role-playing games with choice and consequence, a meaningless dialogue choice is something that will absolutely be criticised in those games. It shouldn't be any different in a walking simulator. Got no idea where they're getting at. That tells me these sorts of people have maybe played the game once. In their head, they thought, oh, I had to make a choice. That must have been meaningful. Let's forget about actually checking out what would have happened if we made the other choice. No, they're just going to roll with it, and apparently that's fine. Now, the other front were games like Unavowed, extremely easy game. That's what I'm talking about when I say that so many of the point-and-click games now, they're much more about being unwilling to confuse the player. There's going to be like one item, you can use it on that one other item in the room that has any interactivity with it, and that's it. There's no thinking there. You might as well make it a walking sim at that point, because if I'm not using my brain, I'm not thinking about the world, and right, I saw that canister earlier, I've got an item that might work with that now, let's go check that out again. Oh, it didn't work. Hold on, there was another similar item somewhere else, I'm going to go check that out now. That gets you exploring, gets you engaging, gets you immersed, and that's what I want more of. I don't want more Unavowed. Maybe it's a good game in its own right, and they've mentioned Broken Age as well. That was an absolute travesty. I would actually say that did more damage to the genre than anything else, because the Double Fine Adventure Kickstarter, it was so successful. I remember seeing it and thinking, right, point-and-click games are back. And then the end result was a really simple game that felt like it was trying to cave to mainstream gaming as a whole, rather than try and bring new interest into a genre that was dead and people hadn't really had an experience to play something modern in the same vein, because that's the only way you're going to get this genre back. You can't re-release Escape from Monkey Island on GOG. The only people who are going to play it are old fans. You need something new that's doing similar stuff. It's going to have the great presentation, which I think Beyond a Steel Sky actually has. I think the art style is really good for what they're doing. Keep in mind they're a small team, so when you see this review shitting on the jank essentially and saying, oh, it's not completely polished, I've played all these 200-person team games with way more polish, why aren't they doing it? I'll tell you why, because Revolution Software, I've had a look, and assuming this website's up to date, they've got about 16 staff members. To expect them to make a AAA polished game, it's unreasonable. Gamespot do it a lot, IGN do it a lot. They pick on small indie studios, essentially, and I'd say 16 people. Yeah, it's not like it's a two-man team, like Ori and the Blind Forest or something, but it's obviously going to be less polished. It's going to be somewhere in the middle, and let's review it and let's objectively look at it from that angle. Yeah, we still need to hold them to some standards, but I played through the game and didn't really have a big issue. There were some polish issues, like sometimes Foster would talk to someone and be facing kind of the wrong way, and that can be a little annoying, it can be a little immersion breaking, but it can be fixed. And I can tell you right now that any AAA game that comes out now, for the most part, it is not finished. It's usually a trashy mess, but because they call themselves early access, or they call themselves, this is stage 1, we've got stage 2 coming next, stay tuned for that. Because they do that, they get a fucking free pass, and they're still selling the game at a full price. They're still selling microtransactions, season passes, and yet GameSpot and the like are still willing to give them an 8 out of 10, a 7 out of 10 at the worst. But Beyond a Steel Sky gets thrown under the bus because apparently it didn't have AAA polish values. And it's not the end of the world at the end of the day. I mean, GameSpot gave it a 5 out of 10, and plenty of other people gave it a pretty good, reasonable score, like the Dark Station, even the Telegraph, for fuck's sake, 8 out of 10. But it would be nice to get a bit of fairness and to see the people who are reviewing these games actually give some service, give something back to video games as a whole. Stop shilling for the flavour of the month and actually find constructive ways to talk about these dead genres that are trying to make a comeback. I would like to see a bit more of that. If you want to give it a 5 out of 10, fine, but do so in the context of what you're actually talking about. Because if you're going to give it a 5 out of 10, but it's made by 16 people, then why are you not holding the same standards to a 200-person team that come out with something of similar polish? It just doesn't make any sense. For me to get point and clicks back to where they're going to be best, it's taking a little bit from games like Thimbleweed Park, maybe a little bit from Beyond a Steel Sky, and then applying them back to what I consider the big classics from the 90s and early 2000s. So what I'm looking at there are games like Monkey Island 2, Grim Fandango. The best parts for me of both of those games is when the world was quite open, and that's when the gameplay was the biggest focus, the immersion was right up there. So I'm talking about like Rubicava from Grim Fandango. That's the bulk of the game, where you've got a number of tasks to do. You can do them in any order, so it's pretty open-ended. But it's almost like a maze to some degree, because you slowly work your way through these puzzles. Each one you do is going to open up a little bit more. It's going to give you a few more options. Maybe you open up or you get access to a new room. Maybe a character changes to some degree. Maybe they move to another location because you did something, and that opens up a few more doors. So that kind of open-endedness, that kind of brings back the mainstream focus, I feel, because that's what they're looking for. A lot of mainstream games seem to be about the open-endedness, so if you've got that in a point and click, which we haven't really seen for a long time, I mean, Thimbleweed Park, I'd say because you were kind of just moving in static direction for the majority of the game, it might not have felt like that for many people. Whereas in something like Monkey Island 2, despite how fucking old it is now, to see what it did there in the early 90s is pretty incredible to some degree. You're moving around 3 different islands, they're very distinct, there's puzzles to be solved on all of them, and they're not self-contained. So you might do something on one island, you might get an item that you're then going to actually use to solve a puzzle on another island. So I think that open-endedness has not been seen in a long time. It couldn't happen even in like Tales of Monkey Island because it was episodic, and that meant they were, again, very self-contained. It didn't really feel like the strengths of Monkey Island 2, even Monkey Island 3 to some degree. So I want them to get back to that. I want to see a mainstream adventure game. Maybe it's not, of course, made by a 200-person team. I'm still talking like Revolution standards, so 15, 16 people. That's pretty big on the grand scale of adventure games in this day and age. So I want to see them get back to something like that. I think that's what would be the big hitter that opens the genre up a bit more. I said this in the last video, but I said this in my other adventure game video from a couple of weeks ago that I think if you make a really hard adventure game that uses more so world puzzles, so I'm not talking about games where you just solve like a Sudoku kind of puzzle or you solve like a Rubik's Cube sort of puzzle. I'm talking about ones that get you in the world with characters, get you exploring. If you make a game like that that's really, really hard, but still logical, so not stupid, not like some of the worst of this era games, I'm talking like really good standard puzzles, really great puzzles where you think, gee, if I had thought about that a bit more, I reckon I could have solved it. Those sort of puzzles. Not the ones where you think, I forgot to pick up a piece of lettuce from the first room of the first game. I'm now in the last screen and I can't solve the puzzle. Fuck. I'm not talking about that. So just good logic. Continue on with not being able to get stuck. That's fantastic. That's actually the genre moving forward. Keep that. That should be the focus. And I think if you make like a really hard, challenging game, it'll be like Dark Souls, where people feel really self-fulfilled to have actually completed that without any help. I mean, if you want to go and look at a walkthrough, be my guest. I mean, I'm sure you can do that, but you're going to take the fun out of it for yourself. And I think most people who are actually interested in this sort of game would like to do it themselves without any spoilers like that. So overall, Beyond a Steel Sky, really good game, great for adventure games, great for the industry. I'm feeling more optimistic about the genre now than I was even a couple of weeks ago, having just played through this and seeing how it all went. I hope that in a couple of years' time, we're looking at a game like this as where things started to lift off, get us back into a good place for adventure games and not leave me feeling like I've been in the last year or so about how Thimbleweed Park couldn't start something up because it just didn't sell well enough for anyone to have any hope for that sort of game. I want to say lastly as well, I'm completely shocked that Space Venture, a game that kickstarted so long ago, it was meant to release in late 2013, that's getting a release as well. So if that's not keeping you optimistic, I don't know what will, because I was completely shocked. I thought that game was absolutely dead and they were just taking people along for a ride essentially. So let's see what happens. Hope you enjoyed the vid. If you did, like, sub, leave a comment, and I'll see you again. Thanks very much. Bye for now.